Welcome to the City of St. Charles School District's 2015 mandatory training on the Seclusion, Isolation, and Restraint Board Policy. Through the adoption of this policy, the Board of Education expects to promote safety and prevent harm to students, school personnel, and visitors in the school district. Foster a climate of dignity and respect in the use of discipline and behavior management techniques. Provide school personnel with clear guidelines about the use of seclusion, isolation, and restraint in response to emergency situations. Provide parents and guardians information about state guidelines and district policies related to the use of discipline, behavior management, behavior interventions, and responses to emergency situations. And promote the use of non-aversive behavioral interventions, including positive behavioral support techniques. The policy can be found online on the City of St. Charles School District website at the following location. It is important for staff to adhere to Board Policy JGGA whenever seclusion, isolation, restraints, and behavior crisis strategies are being used. Violation of Board of Education policies may lead to disciplinary action, including and up to termination. All district personnel are to be trained annually and know the policy and procedures involving the use of seclusion, isolation, and restraint. Use of timeout. Brief removal from sources of positive reinforcement that does not meet the definition of seclusion or isolation. The purpose of timeout is to separate the student from the attention of staff and other students. It's not seclusion or isolation. The child is not alone. The space is not enclosed, and the child is not prevented from leaving for brief periods of time. Nothing in this policy is intended to prohibit the use of timeout as defined in this policy. Use of aversive interventions. An intervention that is intended to inflict pain or discomfort upon a student for the purpose of eliminating or reducing maladaptive behaviors, including such interventions as contingent application of noxious, painful, or intrusive stimuli or activities, any form of noxious, painful, or intrusive spray, inhalant or taste, or any other similar interventions. The term does not include such interventions as voice control limited to loud, firm commands, time-limited ignoring of a specific behavior, token fines as part of a token economy system, brief physical prompts to interrupt or prevent a specific behavior, interventions medically necessary for the treatment or protection of the student, or other similar interventions. Aversive interventions will only be used in accordance with this policy. District personnel should never use aversive interventions that compromise health and safety. The use of seclusion, isolation, and restraint. Seclusion. This is the confinement of a student alone in an enclosed space from which the student is physically prevented from leaving by locking hardware. Seclusion, as defined in this policy, is prohibited except in an emergency situation while awaiting the arrival of law enforcement officers as provided for in state law. Isolation. The confinement of a student alone in an enclosed space without locking hardware. Isolation does not include supervised in-school suspension, detention, or timeout used as disciplinary consequences in accordance with the district's student discipline code. Isolation shall only be used in an emergency situation or when less restrictive measures have not effectively de-escalated the situation and the school has a plan for how to respond in such situations, or with the parent approval as specified in a student's IEP, Section 504 plan, or other agreed-upon plan to address a student's behavior. Isolation should never be used as a form of punishment or for the convenience of district personnel. A student in isolation must be monitored by district personnel who are in close proximity and able to see and hear the student at all times. Monitoring should be face-to-face unless personal safety is significantly compromised, in which case technology-supported monitoring may be utilized. The total time in isolation is to be reasonably calculated based on the age of the student and the circumstances, and is not to exceed 40 minutes without a reassessment of the situation in consultation with parents or guardians or administrative staff, unless otherwise specified in an IEP, Section 504 plan, or other parentally agreed upon plan to address the student's behavior. The space in which the student is isolated should be a normal-sized meeting room or classroom commonly found in a school setting with standard lighting, ventilation, heating, cooling, and ceiling height, and that is free of objects that could cause harm to the student. Physical restraint. The use of person-to-person physical contact to restrict the free movement of all or a portion of a student's body. It does not include briefly holding a student without undue force for instructional or other purposes, briefly holding a student to calm the student, taking a student's hand to transport him or her for safety purposes, physical escort, or intervening in a fight. Physical restraint shall only be used in an emergency situation or when less restrictive measures have not effectively de-escalated the situation and the school has a plan for how to respond in such situations, or with parental approval as specified in a student's IEP, Section 504 plan, or other agreed upon plan to address the student's behavior. Physical restraint will only be used for as long as necessary to resolve the actual risk of danger or harm that warranted the use of physical restraint. Be no greater than the degree of force necessary to protect the student or other persons from imminent bodily injury or to protect property. Not place pressure or weight on the chest, lungs, sternum, diaphragm, back, neck, or throat that restricts breathing. Will only be done by district personnel trained in the proper use of physical restraint. District personnel who use physical restraint shall only use restraint methods in which they have received district-approved training. Further, district personnel who use physical restraint may only do so in the presence of at least one additional adult who is in the line of sight, unless no other adult is immediately available due to an unforeseeable emergency situation. Physical restraints should never be used as a form of punishment or for the convenience of district personnel. Mechanical restraint. A device or physical object that the student cannot easily remove that restricts a student's freedom of movement or normal access to a portion of his or her body. This includes, but is not limited to, straps, duct tape, cords, or garments. The term does not include assistive technology devices. Mechanical restraint shall only be used as specified in a student's IEP or Section 504 plan, with two exceptions. Vehicle safety restraint shall be used according to state and federal regulations. And mechanical restraints employed by law enforcement officers in school settings should be used in accordance with appropriate professional standards and applicable policies. Chemical restraint. Administration of a drug or medication to manage a student's behavior that is not a standard treatment and dosage for the student's medical condition. Chemical restraints shall never be used by district personnel. An emergency situation is a situation in which a student's behavior poses a serious, probable threat of imminent physical harm to self or others, or destruction of property. Emergency situation follow-ups. Following any emergency situations involving the use of seclusion, isolation, or restraint, a meeting shall occur as soon as possible, but no later than 2 school days after the emergency situation. The meeting shall include, at a minimum, a discussion of the events that led to the emergency, why the de-escalation efforts were not effective, any traumatic reactions on the part of the student, other students, or school personnel, what, if anything, could have been done differently, and an evaluation of the process. All staff members directly involved with the emergency situation will be included in the meeting, which will be scheduled and led by the building principal or designee. Positive behavior supports. A range of instructional and/or environmental supports to teach students pro-social alternatives to problem behavior and allow them multiple opportunities to practice pro-social skills and receive high rates of positive feedback. The superintendent or designee is responsible for implementing the district-wide use of appropriate positive behavior supports designed to support or alter behavior in all students. Records. The superintendent or designee will maintain records documenting the use of seclusion, isolation, and restraint, showing when they were used, reason for use, duration of the use, names of district personnel involved, whether students or school personnel were injured, the name and age of the student, whether the student has an IEP, Section 504 plan, or behavior intervention plan, when the parents and guardians were notified, any disciplinary action taken, any other documentation required by federal or state law. The district documentation form can be found on the district website at the following location. Notice to parents and guardians. Except as otherwise specified in a student's IEP or Section 504 plan, following an emergency situation involving the use of seclusion, isolation, or restraint, the parent or guardian of the student shall be notified through verbal or electronic means of the incident as soon as possible, but no later than the end of the day of the incident. The parent or guardian shall receive a written report of the emergency situation within 5 school days of the incident. The written incident report shall include all of the following: date, time of the day, location, duration, and description of the incident and interventions, event or events that led up to the incident, nature and extent of any injury to the student, name of an employee the parent or guardian can contact regarding the incident, and plan to prevent the need for future use of seclusion, isolation, or restraint. Students with disabilities. If the IEP or Section 504 plan of a student with a disability includes the use of seclusion, isolation, restraint, or aversive behavior intervention, the IEP or Section 504 plan must specify the conditions under which seclusion, isolation, restraint, or aversive behavior intervention may be used. The IEP or Section 504 plan must include steps to eliminate the need for the use of seclusion, isolation, restraint, or aversive behavior intervention. Any use of seclusion, isolation, restraint, or aversion behavior intervention must be limited to what is set forth in the IEP or Section 504 plan. Before adding the use of seclusion, isolation, restraint, or aversive behavior intervention to an IEP or Section 504 plan, the student must have undergone appropriate assessments, including, but not limited to, a formal functional behavior assessment, and the student must have a behavior intervention plan in place. Welcome back to the City of St. Charles School District's 2015-2016 Board Policy Training on Seclusion, Isolation, and Restraint. Preventative strategies are intended to prevent the escalation of negative behavior to the crisis stage and may include such things as active listening, encouragement, problem solving, clarifying expectations, redirection, restructuring the environment, social skills training, and sensory integration techniques. Environmental management techniques. Managing the classroom environment is also important in preventing negative behaviors. Some universal supports that should be in place but are not limited to are classroom rules that are taught, posted, and connected to school-wide expectations, adult and student routines that are consistent and practiced, define instructional areas in the classroom that provide clear, visual boundaries and communicate expectations for achievement. Classroom environment that is culturally relevant, enriched with materials that are engaging, motivating, and meet the needs of all students. Active supervision of students by the teacher. Evidence-based strategies that are used to increase student engagement and opportunities to respond. Student choice embedded into instruction. Instruction is skillfully differentiated for a variety of learners. An effective communication system for students, staff, and families. De-escalation techniques. Nonverbal de-escalation techniques include the use of proximity or personal space, body language including facial expressions, gestures, posture, and movements. Verbal de-escalation techniques involve the use of voice, tone, and volume, rate of speech, and the use of appropriate language. The JGGA board policy can be found online on the City of St. Charles School District website at the following location: